Welcome home. Will two homes finally become one? Two households became one when John moved in with Sarah and her son Timian. Soon after they got married, they had 2 kids together.
The clutter monster decided to live in our house and likes to have parties here.
The messiest in the house would have to be my mum. Her art stuff just gets everywhere.
We've got a craft station, Stace.
They're crafty people, look at
They are,
these.
look at all these artworks.
Well, Stacey, I think you've definitely found your kindred spirits here.
This is organised. I mean, they can't eat their dinner, but they've got all the pens of the rainbow. Everything in this room is absolutely everywhere. No systems, no rhyme or reason.
No.
It's just everywhere. And Mum's not the only one whose hobby is taking over.
He's got at least like 10 or 11 bikes, and he only needs 2 or 3. He needs 1.
I'm beginning it's cold.
Okay, then Owen, dinner's ready.
No, not yet.
You want some drinks?
Okay.
It's so lovely to meet you. We have got Anna, our lovely interpreter here. I've got an earpiece in my ear, so someone's telling me everything that translating for me. How are you all feeling?
Nervous.
Nervous? Excited? No.
Oh, cool.
Good.
Are we going now?
Yeah? Let's go, come on. When did it start getting like this?
Probably before I had children,
Oh, really?
because I've always been into art and craft.
And then John moved in.
And then I got pregnant in 3, so it's like in 1 year we had
And then
a
you had
family of
Caitlin.
2, and then 3, and then 4,
Yeah.
and all the clutter.
Ah, okay.
I'm so glad I did that.
You can't blame yourself all the time because it's everybody's responsibility. And I think if you're a parent, you're just going to feel guilty no matter what. What do you love about crafting?
It's doing something really nice and to fix up.
That's why I love crafting. It's almost like an escape to another world.
Yeah.
Over the next 2 days, the family will go through every single item from their home, laid out in a 17,000 square foot warehouse. To really bring a house back, you have to let go of 50%. So, do you feel ready for that challenge?
I'm really wanting to get on with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, how is it? Are you ready? Ready? Let's go. Okay.
I've got the laser set up here because what I'd really like to do is split the room.
So what are you going to do? Use it like a wood divide?
The framework itself will be made out of wood, but looking to make it out of perspex.
So if one of them's, say, having their dinner here or doing some crafts on the sofa, and say the kids are through there, they'll have that direct line of sight to be able to sign to each other still. Nice.
What does CODA stand for?
Child of Deaf Adult.
So, what are these ones?
Coda Love from Coda Camp.
What's that?
In the summer, where children that have deaf parents go.
What's your favourite part about it?
I like one night where we all sit by a campfire and then we sing like songs about codas.
And how does it go?
Codas are what? Red hot.
Codas are what? Red hot. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Should we just keep one? That one?
Maybe
And that
3 for one each.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, I've always been creative and like making things that make me feel good because for me, anything I do creatively is doing something that I can feel calm, I feel relaxed, I do feel again.
So it calms you. all of these projects have been started because of a need to relax. So it's a therapy. But, you know, in the environment it was in before, that wasn't relaxing necessarily, was it? Do you think that's something that you've really lacked doing a lot of recently because of the way the house has been? Being able to sit down with your kids, able to sit and knit?
I don't need to feel guilty that I'm going to food and telling or if I'm touching them, I do a lot with them.
Yeah.
But it doesn't stop the guilt.
Yeah, of course. As mothers, as parents, we always feel that way, don't we? You've got 3 amazing children. You know, they're so lovely, and they're, you know, they're really good kids. You know, you're doing a great job. Doing a great job. Sarah has done very well today in arts and crafts. So I feel like now, John, this is Sarah's payback. This bike.
That's
That's
I wouldn't
Sarah's.
throw that one anyway, so that one going.
What about this one? This is the one you use in the living room. And what did we think about this bike?
I'm taking up space.
I can't be.
I am cleaning, tampering, there are things. I've been undoing it.
But keep it that one. Sorry, then.
That one.
That's mine, but I want that gone.
We've only got 2 out. The one with the phone.
When you never ride.
Is that true, John?
I go.
Runs a long time ago.
Why is it so special, this bike? Oh, it's a leopard print. Right, John.
Okay. Sorry.
Hi!
Hello!
Now they've let go of half their possessions. Welcome home! Will 2 homes finally become one? 7 days ago, the family room couldn't provide a place for precious family time. Now it's been restored into the heart of the home.
We know how important it is that you can see everybody in the family and that you can all communicate, but we still wanted to make sure this was the dining room and that was the living room. So Rob built this screen divider and he made sure that the panels are big enough that you can sign through and communicate.
Wow.
Amazing. Because I can guide them in that house.
Watch this.
Wow.
I know. Now you can actually have somewhere to do all of your arts and crafts because I feel like you had the most incredible collection but never actually got the chance or space to sit somewhere and do the thing that you love.
Perfect.
Not too long ago, the original shed was bursting with bikes.
Well, now...
Oh, wow.
We can give John the man cave he deserves with space for his pride and joy.
I'm going to bring all the interpreters in that made this possible.
Come on, you lot. Thank you so much, thank you.
I know that they're going to be able to communicate as a family better. I know they're going to be able to sit and eat meals with each other and talk to each other and chat through their day, which was being stolen from them by the clutter that was in that house. So it just feels so great to be able to give that back. That was the best.